down, we're starting. Thank you. All sit down, we're starting. Alexandra, not the front to stand up. Harvey as well, you can finish that. Thank you. So, welcome back. I hope you had a wonderful lunch. It is with great pleasure starting this session. Let me introduce to you Martin Coulter, the CEO of PatientsLikeMe, who particularly for this came all the way from Boston. So please join me in welcoming him with a round of applause. All right, Martin, I'll leave it up to you that this is not the last applause you get. So you're gonna present first for 20-25 minutes. Afterwards, the two of us have a short Q&A, and then we actually have a short Q&A with the audience. Thank you so much for being here. Great.
Thank you. You're such an optimist, Henning. Thank you for having me and for being attentive for the next 20 to 25 minutes. Sabine did tell me that. She says, this is the worst time of the day to present. They go over there, they have this huge lunch, they come back, and you can see it. So anyway, I'm hoping that what I'll share with you will be somewhat interesting to most, if not all of you. Henning asked me to come in and talk about the business that I run. I've been CEO now of PatientsLikeMe for 3 years, having had a background working in healthcare for about a dozen years before that, and started out my career as a strategy consultant with Bain & Company. So I think the best place to start is at the beginning. We have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to move somewhat swiftly. The gentleman who is pictured up here, his name is Stephen Haywood. He is the brother of the two founders, Ben and Jamie Haywood. Stephen was the middle brother, and I say was because you know where the story's headed. He was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. At the age of 24 or 26, he suffered from that disease for about 6 years, and he passed away when his night nurse inadvertently unplugged his ventilator, and he suffocated. While he was alive, the family really applied themselves to figuring out how it is that they could help Stephen. The family's interesting in that the father is a MIT professor. He's a physics professor, highly esteemed. And the two sons were systems engineers from MIT. Jamie, the older brother, he left his job in Philadelphia, came up to Boston, and as Jamie will, he decided he was going to single-handedly figure out how it is that he could solve this problem for Stephen. And he would join Stephen at the consultation with the different physicians. And questions would be asked, so tell me, he's at this level of function today, what does the next 12 months look like for Stephen? And the answers that Jamie got and Ben got and the family got weren't satisfying because there wasn't precision to it. How long is it before he's going to get ventilated? Again, one physician may say 2 to 3 years, another physician might say no, 6 years. So Jamie was staggered that for a disease that has reasonably predictable progression in terms of the manifestation of your function and your mobility as it degrades, that there wasn't a model that could point to where somebody is on their curve, their own personal curve, and actually have a way of being able to answer that question from a data-driven perspective using a model versus the doctors doing their very best based on the research that they've read, and most likely on the tens, if not 20s, possibly hundreds of patients that they may have seen suffering from ALS, although you would have to be a very experienced physician to have seen hundreds of patients with this disease. So, with that frustration in mind, the brothers started PatientsLikeMe, and the promise to the patient, the promise to the community that they were targeting was this: knowing for you and your individual, whatever condition that you may have, all the choices you have or have had, and what's happened to those who have made those choices. So a very simple premise at one level, right? The idea of how is it that we can construct a platform that will allow for patients to find other patients like them and just understand their experience, understand their options, and understand what happened to them once they chose an option. With the idea of maximizing the outcome, the end state. But that's complex too. So given my status, what is the best outcome I can hope to achieve, and how can I get there? That's another way to think about that aspiration. And if in fact all of us aspire to thrive, that's complex too, right? What is thriving, particularly if you've got a chronic disease? Is thriving, I don't want to suffer as little as possible? Or is it, no, I actually I want to be as able as possible. I'm willing to put up with what I'm suffering to maximize my ability. Or is it simply not dying? Which ends up actually being often the default mechanism in how we treat people, because that's the one thing we can measure. And I'm going to come back to that word measure. Right? We all have statistics as to what happens to all of us and when it is that over the years, how long we've lived and what that mortality looks like. It cut by different types of people, different conditions, whatever else. It's the one thing that you can measure. But this is a complex question. So let me ask you, Stephen Hawking. We all know Stephen Hawking. He suffers from ALS as well. But he's lived many years, much longer than the majority of the 99% of ALS patients. Does that make him the best ALS patient? Is that the best outcome that Stephen Hawking would want? Or would someone else look at that and say, yes, but his level of function is so low that maybe he's the worst ALS patient? So it's a complex question, and it requires a complex information system to accommodate the data, understand, giving patients the ability to answer that for themselves. It's further complicated by having to think about this not at a single point in time, but longitudinally. So what is the best health that I can achieve, not today, but what is it I can do today that sets me up for best health next week, next year, 30 years from now? Very complex. And what Jamie Haywood and Ben Haywood started out on back in 2005, so 11 years ago at this point, they started out, not that they knew it at the time, but effectively they were starting out on a journey to make the human condition computable. The experience of sickness, the experience of disease, the experience of care, the impact of care. How do you make that computable? How do you make the way in which we live our lives and the experience of how we perform as human beings, how do you make that computable? So this is we have a little demo of a little short minute and a half to give you a sense for how the patients use the system. But very quickly, the platform is a complex informatics platform at one level. It gathers information around your quality of life, your symptomology, from whatever conditions you're suffering from, usually many conditions. It gathers information around your treatments that you're receiving through care, your side effects. It's the basic components of what it means to be a living, functioning human being, organized into a data informatics system that is then presented back to patients so that patients can be much more informed, much more enlightened, and have much more insight, not only about their own health on their own individual records, but within the context of how other patients like them perform, who have similar diseases, similar sets of comorbidities, similar age, gender, whatever the particular filtering criteria might be, is finding patients like me to understand what do their symptomology look like, how are they being treated, are they getting the same drugs, different drugs, are they getting the same, if the same drugs, is the dosage similar or is it different? And you can look at these differences and you can begin to understand what impact does that have then on your fatigue, on the pain that you might be suffering from, your sex drive, your cognition, your mobility. Let me, if I can, try to play this thing. It might require me to. May not come up. Would you try the yes, if you wouldn't mind, just try that. So there's a little testimonial from the patients. It's okay, we can come back to it if necessary. Yeah. We can come back to it if necessary. So patients on this platform, what they'll do is they'll use the platform to track their history of care and progress over time. They'll connect with others, sharing those experiences to learn and be more informed and to be better patients about treating life-changing conditions. What the business effectively does, if you lift out of that, is not only helps individual patients achieve better outcomes and live better together, but we then leverage that information and we leverage the patient networks to support the health system with real-world data in the research, discovery, and delivery of effective treatments, to answer questions around care decisions, and to have and have the health system, whether it be on the biopharma side, payers, providers, have better alignment with and better understanding with the real needs of patients. This may be it.
I just remember an overwhelming fear. I was terrified.
A lot of doctors were giving very vague answers.
I really had no clue what was going on with me.
And I just didn't have anybody to talk to who knew what I was going through.
I was diagnosed with psoriasis.
I had Parkinson's disease.
Relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis.
Refractory epilepsy.
When you find a site like Patients Like Me and you realize that you really aren't in this fight alone, it takes an awful lot of the fear away.
I was amazed at the wealth of information that I found on Patients Like Me.
The most valuable and helpful part of the site is the tools that I get to use on a daily basis to see and track my progress.
The most helpful part of Patients Like Me is the forum for me, because it's the place where the community goes to share what's going on with their lives.
It's like a whole group of friends that understand you more than anyone else.
There's a community out there waiting to help you. Somehow, somewhere, on Patients Like Me is someone who is like you. It's using information that's available and that we can provide to find a cure, and that's what we want.
I I just love the chance to be able to help someone that has psoriasis like me live a little bit of a better life and not have to go through the same experiences I've had to go through.
Finding patients like me was quite frankly the best thing that could ever have happened to me.
So that gives you a sense as to how the consumer patients will use the system, and we currently have this number is a little low, so we've added another 100,000. So we're coming up. We'll hit our 500,000th registered patients as of the end of June, so a month from now. We've got just an abundance of structured data points. All that data that the patients enter, we'll convert into medically readable, computable code. So we'll put it into ICD code and SNOMED and MADRA. That is the code for the for other parts of the medical ontology. So it can be integrated with and it can be used by the medical systems that the healthcare organizations will utilize. And we have more than 2,500 conditions reported on our website. If you do the math, it will say, well, that's not so many patients per condition. But interestingly enough, people with chronic illness very seldom have a single condition. They usually will be reporting several, if not multiple conditions. And you know, the feedback we get for the patients that use our system is that it really does improve their decision making and it improves their outcomes. They've got a better understanding of side effects. They have more of an awareness as to what happens to them when they stop and start their medication. They utilize the system less, so they have less inpatient care, fewer ER visits, and improve critical health behaviors. And what's interesting, people in this room might say, well, isn't that kind of what their doctors are supposed to do? And what's interesting is particularly doctors of these types of patients with chronic illness, they enjoy and they really benefit from having patients come in who are informed about their health, who are in a position to be able to answer the questions that often are asked, but the patients often aren't in a position to tell them how they were sleeping the last 3 times they had their flare in lupus, versus having a digital log that allows them to answer that question, not only answer that question, but then talk about it in a very informed fashion. Moving from the consumer value side, one of the things which I think is I think a unique characteristic of this business is we talked about aggregating the community of patients. We talked about integrating that data into useful form, structuring it to make it value add, and then working with both the biosciences, biopharma, payers, regulators, and health systems and hospitals to advance research and care. These are the types of organizations that we currently have worked with, or we've recently worked with. Up on the top left-hand corner, some of the drug companies that we are partnering with. On the top right-hand corner, some of the providers, including a big relationship with Walgreens. Walgreens it's part of Boots, but Walgreens Boots sees themselves as a provider much more than they see themselves as a pharmacy. Academic research centers and foundations, and then ultimately down here, the sector or the segment of the market that's been longest to evolve to a point where they're open to this type of information. Are the payers and the insurance companies, and we have a relationship with the FDA, which is obviously a very important one for the business. The type of value that we're delivering in the research and development for drugs listed out here, it's giving the drug manufacturers a sense of what the experience of patients are like. When they're in their home and not just when they're in front of the physician or the clinician in a clinical trial or in care. We spend 99.9% of our time outside the doctor's office. The idea is to bring that information into the care setting, into research and discovery, and really begin to unwind and unfold where the unmet need is beginning to segment patients, patient-friendly clinical trials, virtual trials, all the way into really thinking about how do you measure impact for those that are paying for care, how do you empower patients so that they're better patients, and ultimately, how is it that we can use this information and really engage these patients in a manner that starts to put a patient-centric view on what value means in care. Very quickly to finish up, this is some work that we did with an epilepsy drug company with epilepsy patients in the Veterans Administration. Patients as partners, they do better. They simply do. They better understanding of their disease, and they are more proactive. The patient data, don't worry about the graphs here. I'll not get into the explanation here. But we looked at the insomnia data that we had in our system, and we engaged 10,000 patients across different chronic illnesses to understand the patterns of insomnia that would help in the way in which their insomnia was being treated in the context of their chronic illness, and developed a map as to how insomnia impacts different people with different chronic illnesses in a way that really created a huge amount of insight for Merck in their development of an insomnia drug, and now has been implemented in the treatment of patients with chronic disease in terms of insomnia being a driver of some of the severity and variations in those diseases. And then coming all the way back to the beginning, some of the modeling that this type of database and this type of information can allow. We had an ALS patient that asked the very same question that Jamie Haywood asked the doctors with his brothers when his brother Stephen was contracted with ALS. He said, look, this is my curve. This is my functional rating scale. So this is how I'm declining in function. And these curves are all statistical curves from tens of thousands of ALS patients that have been measured on the platform over time. And this is the normative right here in the middle, and you can see the bands. The bands are the outliers. And he said, look, this has been my curve to this point. I'd like to understand what my prognosis is. I'd like to understand how fast am I likely to progress in this condition. And this was in the very early days, and what we were able to do is go out and, What we were able to do is go out and find patients just like Humberto. Nonetheless, there's an animation here which is pretty cool, because what you can do is you can pull patients that have experienced a similar curve to Humberto, not just at that point in time, but over the period of time that we've been tracking, pull that together into a prognosticated model of the future to give Humberto a sense as to what that might look like for him. And if the animation was working, you could see then as to how he tracked to that line. And ultimately, Humberto passed away in January 2009, but it was pretty close. And it was based on that right kind of model that we ran for this patient, that we were able to run really the first ever virtual clinical trial. Wasn't approved by the FDA, so it was a clinical trial that was written up in a periodical. It was very much an innovation at the time, in the virtual setting, where some research had come out on a small number of patients saying that if you took lithium, it would slow the progression of your disease. And we began to notice that patients on our platform were taking lithium, and other patients weren't. And we had a perfect sort of control group situation. And we were able to look at the results of the outcomes of the patients taking lithium versus the patients that weren't taking lithium that were similar in nature. And we're able to publish, really for the first time in a virtual setting, that in fact, no, that taking lithium is highly likely not to retard the progress of these symptoms. In fact, it's not statistically speaking, but it's likely to do you some harm. So anyway, the system as it's set up provides tremendous value to our patients, but I think what's really exciting is the patients really working in concert with industry that allows for this business to really start coming into its own. So there's a lot in front of us. We've got a lot of innovation ahead of us, but for time purposes, I just wanted to finish, and maybe we can have the questions.
All right, Martin, thank you so much. So one of the things I find most fascinating about patients like me is normally when we think of an organization, we're mostly thinking of the employees working at the organization. We think of the CEO, the technical team, and so on. Such an important part of patients like me actually takes place kind of beyond the boundaries, right? The patients are probably like the most important part of patients like me. Can you tell us a little bit about how you integrate them? How does that interaction with the patients look like? How do you succeed in engaging them?
Sure. So it's a really important part of our business. We have what we call the social contract with our patients. So we understand that we are successful only if we maintain the notion of, and the principle of patients first. So we are very patient-centric in everything we do. We're very transparent with our patients as to who we work with, how we make money, and we are and we have a lot of focus around ensuring that the patients have all context around the work we're doing. So I'll give you an example. If we are running a program with Merck or with Sanofi, we will go out to our patients, we will ask our patients to participate, we will let them know, here's what we're doing with Sanofi in hypercholesterolemia. Here's why it's important, here's how you're going to participate, and this is the impact that we hope that you could have. We will then consent them in, we will run IRB approval, which is kind of what you have to do, and then we will give them context through the study as to what's happening, and always bring back the findings to the patients. And what people with chronic illness, they want to be able to share their experience. 92% of patients on our site want to share, but they only want to share if they feel that it's been well thoughtfully stewarded and professionally managed and in a very responsible fashion. So we have turned away work where a pharma company did not want to attach their name to the study. We said we can't work with you. We've turned away work where a pharma company wanted to develop a community of patients on an exclusive basis. We said that's not in the patient's interest. And that's how I think it all works, because I think the patients feel like they're very much a part of this, and they feel that they're not going to be hurt by participation.
So one thing I was wondering about it, some of the students from the class here, we were just talking about kind of how new ventures very often kind of compete against incumbent, right? They're disrupting an ecosystem and really changing it. So I was curious, because Patients Like Me is a very new, innovative player. If you think of these kind of big pharma biofirms like you mentioned, Sanofi, Merck, Genentech, do you think of those as kind of competitors, or do you think of those as collaborators where you kind of create complementary value?
So they're certainly not competitors. In fact, they are the customers in many ways. Most of these organizations have their own initiatives and their own programs of patient centricity underway. It's hard. It's hard for the Sanofis of the world to develop this type of system because the patients will be a little bit suspicious that it's for this particular, it's for a Sanofi. The idea will be to push a Sanofi drug versus kind of what's the right medication or treatment for me from all the drugs. There's regulatory and other constraints that will sometimes prohibit pharma from getting close directly to their patients. So it's a very hard job for particularly the big biopharma to get close to and to understand the patient in a way that we do here. in terms of collaboration, yes, the collaboration is really important, but ultimately, as we build this network out, we want to make this information available to the system. And our job is, how do we make that available in a way that maps to their processes and allows for them to innovate within their system so that they can start incorporating this information to be better at what they do. And that is a little bit of the challenge that we've had in the last 3 years since I've been there. A lot of the senior people in pharma, they're saying, we have to get closer to the patients. We've got to put patients at the center. But it's when you take it down to the person who's leading the phase 3 clinical trial, or the person that's trying to manage kind of an inpatient unit in a hospital or an inpatient service line. Like, they've got a budget, they've got a process, they've got people, they've got deadlines. How do you make room for innovation? And that's the thing which, frankly, has been the hardest thing for us. This is challenging, but it's somewhat easy compared to that, which is how do you get organizations to start accommodating against the appetite that has been expressed by the senior executives.
So one thing we discussed this morning with Randy Commissar was partially how difficult it is actually to create a social venture. And we had a few questions about this, right? That actually a private company might sometimes be easier. You are like in a very kind of interesting kind of spot of the world, so to speak, because you are a private organization, but the value your company creates, you can make the argument any company creates, but in your case that seems to be particularly strong. There's such a strong kind of social mission to it. I wonder how you navigate that. How do you kind of satisfy these kind of contribution to the social good, but also earn money with it? What is kind of the business model? So how do you navigate this path?
Yes, there's not a clean answer to it, but I think there are some principles at least that we live by, and maybe they're transferable elsewhere, maybe not. But we don't charge the patients for using the service, and we spend a lot of money on building the system, on creating a methodology for people to understand much more about their disease and their journey of illness, and to connect them with other people. And there's a massive amount of value in that. We also believe the work we're doing on the back end, it has to be in the interest of the patient. So everything is aligned. There's nothing that we will do that will take away from the patient. It's all in the interest of the patient constituencies that we serve. To the extent that there is an intersection where we can do that in a manner that generates revenue and generates capital, we think that's not inconsistent, and we think it's actually necessary. There was a discussion at the beginning of the company's founding, which I wasn't around at the time, but should the company be a non-profit or a for-profit? And I think the understanding was the amount of money it will take to do what we need to do as this world unfolds, we'll have a much better chance of doing that if we're a for-profit company with an ROI than if we're a non-profit and we won't necessarily have that clean economic equation. So there was a real fork in the road. There was a lot of discussion about it. But back to the social mission, it's always about doing right by the patient. I have a personal passion for what I think is right for healthcare, but also right for people, which is to empower the patient and really be a part of putting patients at the center of healthcare. And so you're on the right side of righteousness. So, in terms of mission, that's always helpful.
Thank you so much. With this, I would love to open it for the audience. We have time for 3 or 4 questions. I will pass the microphone around.
Thanks. I have 2 questions. One which is, are you in a way working as a CRO does with all the patient data you have, or do you collaborate, or do you compete with the contract research organizations?
There is work that pharma would like us to do that they could also ask CROs to do. We're not a CRO, and we're actually very conscious of not wanting to become a clinical research organization, but there are aspects of our work that the clinical research organizations want to get into because they see that clinical trials need to be much more patient-friendly. So sometimes we collaborate, sometimes we may compete.
And the second question was, Most of our healthcare systems, especially in Europe, are hospital-centric and not very well suited to patients with chronic conditions, chronic diseases. And the governments have a hard time to change the system because they've invested so much money, and there are forces to refuse the change. So what, in a concrete way, what can you do to change that?
Well, there's a whole other run that we could do, which is actually moving health out of hospitals into the virtual world. And the idea of actually building out a full virtual profile of each of us as individuals so that we would never have to go to a hospital to get cared for. You can get cared for by anybody on the planet, as assuming that your digital profile is rich enough. So our experience is that this digitization of the human experience somewhat sits above the location of the delivery of care. So we think that we see that that's a trend that's beginning to happen and beginning to kick in. So I think that will be a non-issue for us it'll be less of an issue as we go forward, if that answers your question.
So, all right, my turn maybe. So, can you tell us a little bit more about how do you make sure that the data that you gather, that the records that you gather, that the information that is coming from the patients is actually accurate? Because if the initial information is somewhat biased, it's hard to use it afterwards in a way that would be meaningful. Yeah,
that's a good question. So we have controls, we have methods for ensuring that patients are patients. It's both qualitative moderators, looking at what people are entering and making sure that it doesn't create itself any flags, which sometimes it will. If there are people aren't lurking on the site, where sometimes you'll have, interesting enough, private equity companies, hedge funds will come in and just lurk in some of these communities. No, really, when drugs are released, you'll see them in there, and they get booted out. So we're pretty good at picking those people up. We have also, if we're running a program with a pharma company that requires clinical validation, we will, again, under full consent, we'll ask patients for their clinical data to validate it. And we recently did a match with IMS data, which is a prescription data, a double hash blinded match. And we had a 95% coherence between their data set and our data set. So there's always the chance that there may be somebody who's not a patient or hasn't been diagnosed properly and is actually putting data in, but we think that that's a small amount of data. And frankly, the data that is in electronic health records has as much of a variance in terms of accuracy as this would.
There's just a second question to this one. So you mentioned that patients are patients,
yes.
but then somebody who is not a physician, I suppose there is some space for interpretation of what actually you see when getting in terms of information. So if I report that I suffered from something and there's a result to the treatment.
We've always asked, do you have a diagnosis from a doctor? We always ask that. And so for people who don't, then they're excluded. This is the IMS matching data suggested that 95% of the records suggested that people actually have the diagnosis that they're reporting, and they've been prescribed different drugs that would be for that diagnosis. I think there is a different problem, which we think is real, and that is, for example, we have a rare disease community, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, that will kill you in 6 years. We have 6,000 patients reporting that they have, but it's so misunderstood and so misdiagnosed that we think that there's probably a third, if not a half of those patients their doctors have basically indicated that they have IPF, but our key opinion leaders, the very high-end specialists in these areas, looking at the data, are fairly sure that they don't. So that's a whole other problem that we're trying to grapple with, is as we, in terms of just the variation of diagnosis that comes from the medical community itself, there's not a lot of standardization there.
I had probably a bit similar question. So how do you avoid situations where the patients do not take substances in a way that was not described by the doctors? Because Patients Like Me essentially the forum where the word of mouth spreads very fast, and assuming one patient says, hey, I just identified that substance called crack is very good for me, and then automatically in 48 hours all the other patients start consuming that, and that actually harms them.
That's a good question, yeah.
How do you avoid those situations?
So we cut down on that. We will, that's something that our moderators are looking for all the time, is people giving other people advice, and we do not give advice. We are there as an informational source. So patients, we do not write prescriptions, and we can't afford to have other patients basically doing that on our behalf. So there's always a likelihood that someone's going to go crazy or some nutraceutical or something, or potentially some drug in the label. But that has to be managed. It's got to be. We manage it very tightly, because that's where we will find ourselves in a lot of risk, and so it's a very very big consideration for the company. And we find that it doesn't happen a lot, because people just get it. They understand in the forums that it's self-policed.
Thank you very much for your time today. My question is in regards to, obviously, for the success of an online platform like Patients Like Me requires user volume and scale. And so can you describe, as the company grew, how you were able to successfully generate awareness, retention of users, especially in the US, where I know a lot of these healthcare online platforms you have a lot of startups around this. And then along with that, as you grew in patient volume, how do you address increasing data privacy concerns, especially when dealing with information like healthcare?
Yeah, so two questions there. So the first one is scale. So the company started out in ALS and then moved to other neurological conditions, and ended up getting probably 20% of ALS patients were coming onto the site, which newly diagnosed. So it got scale immediately, and then it got scale in ALS and MS and Parkinson's and other variants of those diseases, because there's lots of different kind of flavors of those diseases. It wasn't until 2012 where it moved to what it called a generalizable platform. So suddenly began to accommodate all diseases. And what we find is that we have our most activity and we have the highest engagement is when, interestingly enough, we are focused working with the system. So we've done a lot of work in IPF, I said, and in lupus, for example, has been a big area for us in the last year. And our lupus population has just bloomed, because people come to it, they find us, and they see all this activity. And we're asking patients all these questions, and those questions are being circulated back. So the scaling thing is almost, it's a function of how active we are within these different disease states. We do want to grow this platform from 500,000 to 3 to 4 million across the next several years, and that in itself will just increase the richness and the depth of the information in the network, frankly. And then to your security question, everybody's under a full consent, and we don't ask for identifiable information. So it's kind of a standard of internet commerce in healthcare. Security, we're not HIPAA covered, and we don't necessarily want to be until we have to be. And that probably will happen off platform, because once you become HIPAA, and HIPAA it's a privacy set of constraints or privacy policies in the US, and the NHS has its own thing, and all these countries have their own thing, but people are in under their own consent, and we ask them not to reveal identifiable information.
Martin, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I'm sure we could continue this for hours without running out of questions. You're going to be around for a bit.
Yeah.
So we're not having a break now, so you actually need to stay seated. There's not even coffee outside. So you really need to stay seated. We're going to have now a second part, and afterwards we're going to have another break. Please join me for the moment.